In the fall of 2024, hospitals in Minnesota started postponing surgeries. So did hospitals in New York and in California. The reason had nothing to do with doctors or nurses or operating rooms. It was salt water. A single factory in the mountains of North Carolina had flooded. And that one flood was enough to leave hospitals across the entire country rationing something as basic as a bag of IV fluid. How does the richest healthcare system on Earth run out of salt water? The answer is a supply chain so lean and so concentrated that a single bad day can leave hospitals across the country short all at once. Here's what happened. In late September 2024, Hurricane Helene dropped a 1,000-year flood on the mountains of western North Carolina. In McDowell County, near the town of Marion, sat Baxter's North Cove plant, the largest IV fluid factory in the country. By the government's own accounting, it made around 60% of the IV solutions used in American hospitals, things like saline and dextrose. That same plant also made much of the country's dialysis fluid. The flood shut it down. And here's the part that matters most. There was no national stockpile waiting in reserve. Baxter's own leaders later said they'd simply assumed one existed. It didn't. So once that plant went dark, the country started to run short. So let's answer it like an operator. Why can a modern hospital run out of the most basic thing it uses? A bag of sterile salt water. This is the same trap we saw with cheap generic drugs, taken to its extreme. Because it turns out the simpler and cheaper a medical product is, the more fragile its supply chain can be. And IV fluid might be the cheapest, simplest, most fragile product in all of medicine. Let me show you why. Start with that number, because it's the whole story in one statistic. Picture 10 bags of IV fluid hanging in hospitals around the country. Before the storm, about 6 of them came from one factory, North Cove. Not 6 from one company spread across many plants, 6 from one building. When a single site makes well over half of what every hospital in the nation needs, you don't really have a supply chain. You have one point of failure with a roof on it. Which raises the obvious question. Why would a country let more than half of something this essential come from a single factory? The answer, again, is economics. And it starts with just how little a bag of saline is actually worth. A liter bag of IV saline is, chemically, about 9 grams of salt dissolved in sterile water. One analysis back in 2013 put the cost to actually manufacture that bag at roughly $1. $1. It is, quite literally, salt water in a sterile plastic pouch. And that near worthlessness is not a strength. In this system, being cheap is the vulnerability. Now, you may have seen a hospital bill charging dozens, even hundreds of dollars for a single bag of IV fluid. Both numbers are real, and the gap between them is not the manufacturer getting rich. That markup happens later, in the tangle of hospital billing and middlemen. It isn't the manufacturer getting rich. The maker's side is the opposite problem. These are commodity generics sold to giant hospital buying groups that compete the price toward the floor. So the company making the bag earns very little on each one. Hold on to that. The maker of this life-critical product runs on razor-thin margins. That's the fact that drives everything else. So follow the logic. IV fluid has to be perfectly sterile, which means a tightly regulated factory that takes years to build. It's heavy and bulky, a liter of water in a bag, so it's expensive to ship and expensive to warehouse, which means nobody wants to stockpile it far from where it's used. It earns almost no profit per unit, and because there's so little money in it, only a few companies still bother to make it at all. In the US, essentially Baxter, B. Braun, and ICU Medical. Put those traits together and you get a product that's essential, cheap, and made in just a few places. That is the recipe for fragility. There's one more piece, and it's the one that turns fragility into a full-blown crisis. Nobody keeps much of a cushion. Hospitals run IV fluids on what's called just-in-time inventory. Because the bags are bulky and cheap, and were always assumed to be available, many hospitals keep only a few days' worth on hand rather than weeks or months. There's no national strategic reserve and often little cushion locally. In a normal week, that's efficient. But it means the whole country runs this essential supply with almost no margin for error. So when North Cove flooded, there was very little standing between the empty factory and the empty shelf. And here's what makes this more than a freak weather story. IV fluids were already in trouble long before that hurricane. Plain saline had been on the FDA's shortage list since 2018. Sterile water since 2021. Several concentrations of IV dextrose since 2022. So Helene didn't break a healthy system. It hit a supply chain that was already stretched thin and chronically short. The flood was the biggest blow, but the fragility was there the whole time, waiting. Once supply is this concentrated and this lean, almost anything can tip it over. A hurricane floods the one dominant plant. That's 2024. A contamination recall or a failed inspection takes a factory offline. A bad flu season spikes demand for IV hydration faster than a lean plant can respond. That's what happened back in 2014. And every one of these lands the same way because of the last box. There's no idle, qualified spare capacity standing by to replace the lost volume fast, and no reserve to draw down. In most industries, a supplier stumble is a headache. Here, it's a nationwide shortage of salt water. If this feels familiar, it should, because the same company lived almost the same story 7 years earlier. In 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, where Baxter ran several medicine factories. The damage on the island contributed to a national shortage of IV bags that dragged into the severe flu season of early 2018, with hospitals receiving a fraction of what they ordered. The same company, a different storm, 7 years apart. It's a reminder that when medicine manufacturing clusters in places exposed to disaster, a single storm can ripple out into hospitals far away. And that kind of risk doesn't fade on its own. Getting that one plant back was brutal. Baxter's chief operating officer described walking into the flooded factory in the dark and, quote, "I couldn't see the hand in front of my face. Workers had to build a makeshift bridge out of salvage just to move the first truck out. This is what recovery from a single-point failure actually looks like. Not a switch you flip, but months of hauling water and mud out of the building half the country depends on." And it was slow. The plant flooded in September 2024. Baxter rebuilt over the following months, and the FDA didn't officially declare the national saline shortage over until August 2025, roughly 11 months later. That's the better part of a year in which hospitals were managing tight IV supplies because a single plant went down. A shortage like this isn't a bad week. It can stretch across most of a year. To bridge the gap, they did something almost absurd. Baxter airlifted nearly 18,000 tons of IV fluid from its factories overseas on the order of 200 cargo flights, flying bags of salt water across oceans because there was no other way to get them here fast enough. The FDA, meanwhile, temporarily allowed imports from foreign plants and let hospital pharmacies compound their own fluids. It worked, barely, but stop and picture it. A country flying in salt water by the plane load. That's the cost of having no slack. On the ground, hospitals did whatever they could. Systems from Minnesota to New York postponed elective surgeries to conserve fluid for emergencies. Where it was safe, doctors switched patients from an IV drip to drinking fluids by mouth. In some places, reportedly, they leaned on oral electrolyte drinks where it was clinically safe. These are careful, capable hospitals improvising around a shortage of the most basic supply they have. It's a striking picture of just how thin the margin really is. There's a strange coda to all this. Even after North Cove came fully back online, demand for IV fluid didn't. Hospitals, having learned to conserve, were reported using on the order of 10 to 15% less than before. And in early 2026, Baxter cut around 90 jobs at that same plant, with demand still running below pre-storm levels. Think about what that says. The margins on this product are so thin that a modest, permanent drop in use is enough to shrink the very factory the country nearly ran out without. The economics that made it fragile are still running the show. So what would fix it? The same answer as the drug shortages, and it cuts against a market built to chase the lowest price. Stop buying purely on who's cheapest, and pay a premium for suppliers who keep spare capacity and more than one plant. Build a real national buffer stock of essential fluids, the strategic reserve everyone simply assumed already existed, and spread manufacturing across more sites and more geography, so a single storm can't take out the majority of the supply. None of it is free, but the alternative is what we just watched. Flying salt water across the ocean because a product that's cheap to make had no backup. So put it together. A hospital can run out of IV fluid because the bag is a rock-bottom priced commodity with almost no margin in it. So only a few companies make it in only a few places, because everyone runs lean and keeps just days in reserve with no national stockpile behind them. And because when the one dominant plant floods, there is nothing to catch the fall. The simplest, cheapest, most essential product in the building has the least protection of anything in it. It's not bad luck, it's the predictable result of a system that rewarded cheapness and forgot about resilience. If you want the operator's view of how healthcare actually works, the systems behind the headlines in plain English, the breakdowns are at shanewelter.com/free. Next in this series, we leave the supply chain behind and follow the money on a single drug that millions of people need just to stay alive, one that's cheap to make and famously expensive to buy. Why does insulin cost so much? That's next.